Hello and welcome to the Financing a Sustainable Future podcast, brought to you by the Initiative in Sustainable Finance, funded by the Global School of Sustainability here at LSE. I'm Tom Gosling, Professor in Practice and Director of the Initiative. This is a podcast where we talk to LSE academics about their research on sustainable finance in a way that is accessible for practitioners. I'm delighted to be joined today by Stefano Cascino, Associate Professor of Accounting here at the LSE, to discuss his paper Behind the Corporate Veil, How Business Groups Arbitrage ESG Disclosure Mandates, co-authored with Maria Correa. So there's been this strong policy push globally towards mandatory ESG disclosure, which is based on the idea that transparency and accountability improve real-world outcomes. What gap in our understanding were you trying to address, and why do you think business groups are a particularly important setting to study?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on the podcast, Tom. It's an honor to be here. This is a very interesting question because what motivated us was a fairly simple gap in the literature. As you were saying, there is a growing body of evidence that shows that ESG transparency mandates are important and they can improve firm-level outcomes because they increase, for example, the degree of accountability. They put pressure on the firms because stakeholders now see more what's going on inside them. But most of this literature typically focuses on the firm as a standalone entity. But in the real world, that's not how economic organizations actually function. A large share of economic activities actually sit within business groups that are formed of very different entities that are legally independent, although control is organized as a whole. And now, why is this important? Well, because a natural question is, if there is a ESG disclosure mandate that operates and is enacted at the parent country level, how this affects the entire group is an open question, right? And so on the one hand, we have a centralized controlled organization, an enterprise, but on the other hand, we have legally independent entities that might be subject to different pressure, right? And the natural question is, do business groups actually arbitrage this organizational fragmentation to their advantage to basically neutralize, at least in part, the intention of this mandate?
Your empirical setting exploits the staggered introduction of ESG disclosure mandates across parent company countries, while subsidiaries operate across many different jurisdictions. So could you walk us through why this setting gives you credible identification of causal effects, and what's the key comparison in your difference in difference design?
Yeah, that's very important because indeed we want to make sure to identify a causal link between the enactment of the mandate and the results that we document. And we believe that our empirical design lends itself to a strong identification because it exploits two key features. On the one hand, we have the staggered adoption of disclosure mandates, ESG disclosure mandates in several countries around the world. And on the other hand, we have subsidiaries that are located in many different countries. So think about the following. We have, say, two subsidiaries that are very similar. They operate in the same country. They are from the same industry, yet their parents are located in two different countries, one of which enacts a mandate, an ESG mandate at some point in time, and another one doesn't. And so the comparison between the incidence, this ESG performance of two subsidiaries pre and post the enactment of the mandate in the parent country of one of the two allows us to tease out the effect of the mandate on the subsidiary incentives to engage in behavior that might not conform to the expectations of the regulator.
So a distinctive feature of the paper is you focus on subsidiary level ESG incidents using rep risk data. So why did you choose ESG incidents rather than, for example, ESG ratings? And what do incidents allow you to capture that the aggregate ratings often miss?
Yeah, so we deliberately focus on ESG incidents because what we really want to capture is negative outcomes, not firm self-presentation or the way a rating agency might aggregate a wide range of inputs into a score. And we leverage this data set that is rep risk, which is especially useful in our case. Why? Because the incidents that rep risk collects are event-driven. So they are not the result of some disclosures of firm, which in our case is very important because we wouldn't want to document a mechanical effect of disclosure, meaning firms disclose, that gets picked up in the data set, and that's why we observe it, which is most likely the case for a ESG score of one of the ratings providers, right? It might be that these ratings are aggregating a series of inputs, also reflecting disclosure of firms, which is what we don't want to happen. We want to focus on incidents that happen at specific locations within the architecture, within the network of a business groups, and incidents that also have different degrees of severity. They are of a different type, they have a different media reach, and are generated by subsidiaries located around the world.
That's very clear. And so let's get on to the findings now. So you find that after ESG disclosure becomes mandatory in the parent country, the parent firms improve their own ESG performance, but at the same time, ESG incidents increase at the subsidiary level, and you estimate about a 16% increase in subsidiary incidents following mandate adoption. So can you explain this headline finding, why it challenges the idea that mandatory disclosures necessarily improve sustainability outcomes, and how economically meaningful is the magnitude, and what types of ESG incidents are driving the increase? Sorry, a lot of questions in one there, but...
No, that's perfect. Actually, it makes sense to address them all at once. And in fact, I would say that the headline result in our paper is that indeed, when a parent country enacts a certain disclosure mandate, one would almost think that ESG performance will improve everywhere in the corporate structure. What we document is that that's not the case, precisely because this business group can leverage their corporate structure, and they are fragmented across multiple jurisdictions that enjoy different degrees of, let's say, legal protection for the shareholders of the parent, different degrees of enforcement quality, different financial reporting or ESG reporting infrastructures. Precisely because of this fragmentation, we do see that parents, being aware of that, might strategically reallocate within the corporate structure their ESG efforts, right? And so what we do find is that whereas there is an improvement at the parent, this improvement in terms of reduction in incidents is in part, at least, the result of a reshuffling of ESG bad behavior towards subsidiary, where the cost of misbehavior is lower and the probability of detection is also lower, precisely because of weak enforcement, because of legal protection and so on.
Let's dig into that a little bit more then, because in the paper you show that the companies don't just sit still when these disclosure rules come in, and they actually adjust how the whole group is organised. And so let's start with the changes inside the group. So you've already mentioned that companies shift more activity into subsidiaries after ESG disclosures become mandatory. Can you say a bit more about that? What does it look like? And then in the paper, you also talk about external measures where firms sell off certain subsidiaries. And are they getting rid of problem subsidiaries, the ones with higher ESG risks? What's going on here?
So yes, I believe that this is probably one of the most interesting parts of the paper because business groups are certainly not passive to regulation. They actively reorganized along both an intensive margin and an extensive margin. What do I mean by that? Well, on the intensive margin, we find that subsidiaries become more heavily used in two ways. On the one hand, we see that parents use is more productive capacity at the subsidiary level, so you can think of reallocation of economic activities towards these subsidiaries. And at the same time, we also find that employee utilization in subsidiaries become stronger, meaning that economic activity is actually becoming more intense at subsidiary levels, which in turn can lead itself to some sort of negative ESG outcomes. So, for example, employee-related incidents. And this is this intensive margin, right? So I exploit fragmentation within the group and I relocate production where I know that even though there might be unintended consequences like ESG risks, it can still be convenient because the probability of detection of misbehavior is lower. But then there is also an extensive margin. So how costly can it be to have a subsidiary that is really engaging in excessive negative ESG behavior? It comes to the point where the trade-off for the parent is unclear. It can be that the subsidiary is certainly not synergistic, meaning is not providing benefits to the group. On the one hand, this becoming excessively risky, and so that's a target subsidiary that most likely the group will divest from. And so we have some sort of partial divestiture where we observe a decrease in the ownership in these subsidiaries, which obfuscate the link between the parent and the subsidiary. And then when this is really visible, there is an outright complete divestiture, which is when the parent actually sells off the entire stake in the subsidiary. And we believe that this continuum, right, intensive and extensive margin, is really interesting because it's in line with our theoretical predictions.
Yes, it's fascinating. And then you get into where businesses shift these activities to, and you find that subsidiaries in countries with weaker rule of law, lower government effectiveness, and where parent companies are less likely to be held liable for subsidiary torts, you see larger increases in incidents. Now, on the face of it, this justifies a fairly cynical interpretation. Can you explain what's driving this pattern?
Absolutely, and you are certainly right. It does paint a cynical view of these business groups as organizations that take advantage of their structure to minimize their risk exposure. And that's indeed the case. In fact, this reminds me of how we teach our students the corporate legal form, right? We focus a lot on the concept of limited liability. A parent should be exposed to the risk of a subsidiary up until the contributor capital, not beyond it. But in reality, that's the case in certain geographic contexts. Think about the US or the UK, where protection legally, the legal doctrine says the protection of limited liability is very strong, but in other contexts, such as German law or more civil law environments, sometimes courts pierce the corporate veil and they can sue parent companies for the torts of subsidiaries, even beyond the limited liability. Now, exploiting the geographic footprint of the group, if I know that I have a subsidiary in a country where piercing the corporate veil is not really possible, well, then guess what? I might have an incentive to relocate economic activity there, because if there is a certain a negative ESG outcome, the likelihood that that can be, causing problems for me at the parent level is lower. Similarly, if I operate in a country, I have a subsidiary in a country where NGOs are quite limited in what they can achieve, in the pressure that they can put, well, I could strategically place a lot of emphasis on activities there because I feel protected. I know that the likelihood of an incident emerging or of a direct culpability being found by a local court is much lower.
In the end, everything comes down to incentives, right? It's a fascinating finding. And I mean, another important result you find is that regulatory arbitrage is more pronounced among financially constrained business groups. Why do financial constraints matter here? What does this tell us about the cost side of ESG compliance? And maybe more broadly, what heterogeneity did you find across firms or industries that practitioners should pay particular attention to?
Yeah, so obviously, financial constraints matter because ESG investments are costly. And so there might be firms and business organizations that are financially unconstrained, and they could commit to serious ESG investments, and so clear investments in abatement strategies, because they have the luxury to wait for the positive returns associated with these ESG investments. But there are many other business groups and organizations that maybe are more financially constrained and tied. And for them, investing in very costly endeavors in terms of abatement, for example, especially if it is the case that the associated returns are not visible in the short run, well, then this organization might find it more convenient to engage in regulatory arbitrage. And that's what we kind of find in the data. We find that the effects of regulatory arbitrage are very much observable for financially constrained business groups, whereas those that are not financially constrained are more prone to be serious in their engagement with the regulation. And then, of course, we have a lot of variation in our findings. You were mentioning what practitioner could think about in terms of drivers or where we would expect this regulatory arbitrage effect to be more pronounced. Now, think about it. If we have subsidiaries that are manufacturing, that are very far away from final consumers, that are those that are very close to NGOs, right? Then maybe a parent company might feel pressures to relocate economic activities up the supply chain within those manufacturing subsidiaries because they are insulated from the pressures of NGOs. Whereas a business group that has more retail subsidiaries, where the feeling of the pressure coming from stakeholders and consumers being very close, maybe lend themselves to be less of a target for regulatory arbitrage activities. And so if I were a practitioner, if I were a regulator, or if I were a professional investor trying to think about how regulation can be arbitraged within the boundaries of the firm, I would think of financial constraints as a main driver. I could think about industry composition, and I will also think about the nature of the legal regimes to which the different parts of the groups are exposed, more prone to limited liability protection or more prone to piercing the corporate veil.
Very, very interesting. So overall, I'd say your results suggest that standalone country-level ESG disclosure mandates could have unintended cross-border consequences. So what needs to change? I mean, in the paper you emphasise the importance of an enterprise approach to disclosure. What does that mean in practice? And given the various sort of jurisdictional, regulatory, geopolitical challenges, I mean, how realistic is that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a billion-dollar question, really. But it's important because at the end of the day, we have on the one end regulation that is fragmented, applied at the country level, but firms operate as integrated entities across a web of different organizations operating in different countries. And so some sort of adjustment needs to happen in order to make sure that we have regulation that is effective at curbing these regulatory arbitrage activities. And the idea here is to adopt an enterprise approach to regulation. So regulations are designed currently having in mind the entity, but entities are legal persona, and they are basically looking at firms within certain countries in isolation. But if regulation were to be designed having an enterprise in mind, with the enterprise not being the legal form, but rather the economic substance, and say a firm that has operations all over the world wouldn't be a collection of legally independent entity, rather there will be a unified economic enterprise that can be sued, that has rights, that produces externalities, and that can be held liable as a group. If regulation were to be designed like that, that would be really, really, really important.
Yeah. Yeah, well, there's a challenge for the future, for sure. So finally, situating these findings within the kind of broader market environment, if ESG risks can just be shifted around within business groups, what does this imply for how investors, banks, rating agencies should assess ESG risk at the consolidated level? And do your findings even suggest that current ESG data and disclosure frameworks may systematically understate risk in multinational groups?
So we suggest that actually that can be the case, that there could be an understatement of risk if practitioners rely too heavily on consolidated ESG disclosure information. Why that's the case? Now, if we think about the parallel with financial reporting, we do know that the business group produces a consolidated financial report that in a way summarizes and aggregates information that often stems from individual financial statements produced by each subsidiaries. That doesn't happen very often in the context of ESG. Why? Because subsidiaries don't produce their own standalone ESG report. And so a lot is on the effort made by the parent to collect this information, right? And this is the bright side. On the dark side, we would think, well, if individual, separate, standalone ESG reports of subsidiaries are not observable, well, that could basically represent a blind spot that could be ex ante used by parents in order to obfuscate information about subsidiaries, even within a consolidated set of ESG financial reports, right? And so if we think of it this way, we certainly want to push investors, regulators to think about more of the composition of the ESG performance that stems from different environment. Because an ESG effort in an environment that is subject to a lot of scrutiny, very high quality enforcement, is different from the same ESG effort or observable effort that is produced in an environment where regulations are lax, enforcement is really weak, and there is no public pressures from NGO. But in what we observe, we aggregate everything together. This aggregation can be strategic, and the weights in the aggregation sometimes are not observable. And so if we think about ESG ratings, right, where we simply aggregate all these inputs in one score, what are the inputs? How have they been weighted? Have they taken into account legal frameworks? Have they taken into account the differences in limited liability and exposures to risk and so on? And so this should push practitioners to think more deeply about the underlying quality of the information that they have at their hand when they make investment decisions or decisions about regulatory actions and so on.
Well, Stefano, that was a really interesting discussion, and it really is another example for me of how when you introduce a regulation, what you hope might happen isn't always what actually happens, and you always have to put yourself in the shoes of the regulated entity and what they might do in response to it. So I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
You've been listening to the Financing a Sustainable Future podcast with me, Tom Gosling. If you enjoyed the conversation, please like, share and subscribe on your favourite platform. To find out more about the work of the Initiative in Sustainable Finance, which is funded by the Global School of Sustainability here at LSE, please go to fmg.ac.uk/ISF.